morning. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Andrew Krepinevich, President at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. It's my pleasure to welcome you here this morning for the rollout of our latest report toward a new offset strategy. The report's author is Bob Martinage, who's kind of a CSBA alum who went off to the Office of the Secretary of Defense and another senior position in the Department of the Navy for about 5 years, but we captured Bob back once he completed his tour of duty. So he comes with not only a long experience in looking at strategic issues at CSBA and in government, but also, in a sense, an insider's perspective as well as an outsider's perspective. We thought doing a report on this was going to be a particularly important contribution we could make, not only because the Defense Department, Secretary Hagel and Deputy Secretary Work certainly have emphasized this, because it really seemed about time to begin to look at these kinds of issues. In some respects, we got strategically lazy at the end of the Cold War. We had so much military capability built up at the end of the war, and the threat had diminished so greatly that we really didn't have to think long and hard about how to use our scarce resources carefully. And then after 9/11, Secretary Gates, I think, once said the spigot was wide open. Before he left, he said the spigot was closing. And in fact, we're in a very unusual period where you have arguably rising challenges to our national security in the form of three revisionist powers, three countries that have major outstanding claims on the existing order. No surprise, those countries would be China, Iran, and Russia. And so in that kind of an environment where you have new challenges to the international order, where you have declining resources, it really pays to put your thinking cap on and start to think about what kind of a strategy you would pursue. And Secretary Hagel, Deputy Secretary Work have focused on an offset strategy, developing an offset strategy. And really, when you think about it, strategy at the core is about identifying, developing, and exploiting new areas of advantage. The international system, the military competition is very dynamic, particularly with the rapid rate of advance in technology these days. And so, particularly in times like this, it's incumbent on us to think about, well, what are those new sources of advantage and how can we develop them? And also, how do they link into our security objectives? And I think Bob has done a terrific job in his report in addressing these kinds of questions. So without any further delay, let me turn the presentation over to Bob Martinage. Bob?
Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming out on a rather cold and dreary day. Glad you could all come. I'm just going to be hitting the wave tops of the presentation, try to hit the main points so we have enough time for Q&A, because I'm hoping that some of you have already read the executive summary or the paper. So I'll just kind of hit the high points. So I guess the first thing is, why an offset strategy? As Andrew mentioned, DoD faces a period of fiscal austerity of unknown duration. But at the same time, we face numerous national security challenges around the world that cannot be ignored. Resurgent Russia and Crimea and Ukraine, China continuing to seek hegemony in the East Asia and the South China Sea, North Korea as belligerent as ever, Iran pursuing its missile arsenal along options to try to close or influence traffic in the Strait of Hormuz, and pursuing nuclear weapons. We have ISIL, the radical Islamic threat in Iraq, Syria, around the world, Afghanistan, Africa, Central Asia. And then also adversaries developing and deploying anti-access area denial capabilities specifically designed to threaten traditional U.S. options for power projection. So our capability and capacity to project power is arguably declining. We face this period of fiscal austerity. So one of the ways to deal with that is an offset strategy, to deal with the growing scale and complexity of the security challenges we face in a fiscally constrained environment. This is not the first time that we've been in this type of situation. The countries have had to grapple with intensifying national security challenges at the same time being under fiscal pressure several times in the past. And two examples of that is in the wake of the Korean War, President Eisenhower's New Look defense policy in 1953 basically emphasized large numbers of nuclear weapons, long-range bombers, and missiles to contain Soviet expansion. And we'll talk about that one example in a little bit more and what lessons maybe we can draw for the present day. And then about 20 years later, Secretary of Defense Harold Brown and Undersecretary Bill Perry developed what they called the offset strategy at the time to offset the numerical advantage of Warsaw Pact forces in the Central Front in Europe. And to do that, they emphasized stealth, precision-guided weapons, and improved C4ISR. So we'll talk a little bit about that example as well. So coming out of Korean War, President Truman in NSC 141 called for a significant increase in defense spending in order to meet our containment strategy commitments under NSC 68. Eisenhower coming into office was really determined to deter the USSR without bankrupting America, as he viewed it. The link between the military strength and economic strength was inseparable, and you couldn't have one without the other, and we needed to find a better way to offset Soviet conventional ground force strength, which outnumbered the U.S. by roughly 6-1 at the time. And the concern was at the time that the Soviet Union would continue to initiate proxy wars and wars in the periphery that would exhaust the U.S. over time, and the example in the time was the Korean War. So he came into office, launched the Solarium study in the summer of 1953, which led to NSC 162-2 that fall, which basically people refer to as the massive retaliation doctrine. But the idea was we had a lead in nuclear weapons and delivery systems at the time, and the idea was to leverage that lead, to sustain that lead, in order to backstop outnumbered conventional forces. And in order to do that, they emphasized, as you can see here, accelerated fielding of the hydrogen bomb, which was first tested in 1952, pulling back the bombers from Europe, the B-47s, and adding tankers to the fleet and the B-52, investing in ICBMs and SLBMs, and then a range of other options for the distant early warning line, the ballistic missile early warning system, airborne alerts, dispersal, silos, and so on, all to improve the survivability of the force and try to extend that advantage. So during that time, that strategy arguably worked. Containment worked, and as a percentage of GNP, defense fell from 13% to 9% between 1954 and 1961. In order to implement the strategy, the Air Force budget, specifically Strategic Air Command, went up pretty significantly. The Air Force represented 47% of the budget, while the Army and the Marine Corps in particular shrank during that period. So what are some of the lessons we might draw? First, the need for a balanced strategy. You know, while the moniker is massive retaliation, that's what people think of when they think of NSC 162-2 and the new look. It also called for ready forces suitably deployed and adequate to deter or initially to counter aggression around the world. So it wasn't a replacement of conventional forces, it was a backstopping of conventional forces. You still needed balance in the overall posture in order to have presence and deterrence around the globe. The global air warfare capability provided strategic freedom of maneuver. It also reduced the vulnerability of our forward bases. Threats of asymmetric punishment, that's striking where and with means of our own choosing, is potentially a very powerful instrument of deterrence and something that we could build on in the future. Then, as now, covert operations can provide an affordable option for achieving some of our national security objectives, and alliances matter. They complicate adversaries' planning, they potentially impose costs, and they can help us to share the burden. So now, skipping forward in time about 20 years, now in the wake of Vietnam, the loss of U.S. nuclear parity with the Soviet Union. Now the Soviet Union exceeds us in the nuclear realm, and an ongoing Soviet buildup and modernization of conventional forces in Europe. So now NATO finds itself outnumbered by roughly 3-1. So Secretary of Defense Harold Brown and Bill Perry come in and say, well, what are we going to do about this problem? And one of the ways they thought to deal with the problem was to come up with new means of defending Europe, being able to shoot deep, see deep, and then shoot deep into Warsaw Pact territory in order to go after Soviet second echelon forces, those forces that would be reinforcing the front lines. So the idea was to be able to attrit those forces before they could get there. This was later became the basis for the air-land battle concept, or follow-on forces attack in NATO parlance. To implement that concept, several new capabilities were required. And you can kind of see here the core thrusts. New intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance platforms, new precision-guided munitions, stealth aircraft that could survive in the dense air defense environment, space, using tactical use of space for ISR communications and navigation in the form of GPS. And you can see the many capabilities that we've really leveraged a lot over the last couple decades came out of this period. So some of the lessons, technology can, in fact, multiply combat effectiveness. It can make up for a numerical disadvantage, and certainly that was the case in Europe. It's possible to shift the competition into areas where we have an advantage. At the time, it was information technology. We had access to the West. We had controls in that technology that Warsaw Pact could not easily get at, and we could use those to develop the C4ISR systems that really gave us the advantage, and it was hard for the Soviets to try to copy. That said, we couldn't afford to have high-end capabilities everywhere in the world, so an explicit part of the strategy was a high-low mix. Having some of these information technology-enabled forces where needed, but then they were complemented by lower-end capabilities to get the scale that we needed around the world. Then lastly, institutional momentum or commitment really matters. Many of these technologies are actually rooted in the late 60s and early 70s. They were kind of packaged into this new look, the offset strategy in the 70s, but they really weren't developed and fielded in quantity until the 1980s and arguably even into the 1990s. So it takes time to realize these strategies. So what might a third offset strategy look like? I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but I'm going to come back to it in detail. But the foundation of a new offset strategy could be exploiting U.S. advantages in unmanned operations, long-range and low-observable air operations, undersea warfare, and complex systems engineering and integration to bring it all together to allow us to project power differently, including in A2AD environments. Some of the other elements of the strategy or aspects of the strategy would be reduce reliance on forward bases and space-based capabilities, to develop a family of new concepts of operation that leverage a mix of new and legacy capabilities, shifting slightly towards an emphasis on deterrence by denial and punishment rather than trying to restore the status quo ante, and then thinking about how to impose costs on adversaries as part of a long-term competition, and how do we leverage our alliances to gain positional advantage, to complicate an adversary's defensive planning, and to share burdens. So I'll come back to all this in much more detail in a second. So why not business as usual? Why not just kind of continue on the same path we're on now? I'd say relative to our security commitments, on our current path, we face both a capacity gap and a capability gap. And together, those gaps heighten overall strategic risk. And I'm going to talk about that in more depth. So first, the capacity challenge. The QDR, 2014 Quadrennial Defense Review, argues that the U.S. will have sufficient military capacity to defeat one aggressor and, quote, deny the objectives of or impose unacceptable costs on another aggressor in another region. So this is sort of a 1+ force sizing construct. As the National Defense Panel review noted, however, that's the last bullet I think is very important. The U.S. military must have the capability and capacity to deter or stop aggression in multiple theaters, not just one, even when engaged in a large-scale war. So the question is, how do we do that? How do we do that in a fiscally constrained environment? Because I think it's right. The security reality we find ourselves in is more than one or two potential aggressors. We need to be able to cover down on multiple aggressors concurrently around the world. The question is, how do we do that in an affordable way? The second issue is the capability gap or capability challenge. Really, since at least the first Gulf War, arguably even longer, the traditional U.S. approach to power projection has been to build up combat power and logistical support in theater, so-called iron mounds of supplies, maximize air power sortie generation from close-in land and sea bases, and then, as necessary, deploy heavy mechanized ground forces to finish whatever needs to be done. And the problem with that approach, it requires political access to forward bases in littoral waters, which sometimes is not available. We've seen that several times over the past decade that we're denied access to bases forward. It depends on unimpeded use of ports and airfields, which again may increasingly be difficult, and I'll get to that in more depth. It's strategically unresponsive. It requires months to prepare and execute. So often we find ourselves having to restore the status quo rather than trying to deny an adversary from achieving their objectives in the first place. And it's difficult to implement in multiple theaters simultaneously. Thus, the QDR shift from 2 to sort of 1+ as a force sizing metric. And lastly, and I think most importantly, it entails growing operational risk. And basically what's happening is our monopoly on the second offset strategy, which were sort of these reconnaissance strike networks, is slipping away. Prospective adversaries have watched how we project power over the last several decades, identified vulnerabilities, and then built their own reconnaissance strike capabilities to go after U.S. weaknesses. And that's the problem we face. So what are those? First, close-in ports and air bases are increasingly vulnerable to attack by ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, air power, and then closer in, guided rockets, artilleries, and mortars. Surface ships and carriers are becoming increasingly easy to detect, track, and attack at range, potentially thousands of miles. Right now, it's about 1,000 miles in the case of the DF-21 that China has deployed. In the future, it could be significantly longer than that. Non-stealthy aircraft are increasingly vulnerable to modern, networked, integrated air defense systems. Then lastly, space is no longer a sanctuary. Adversaries are developing capabilities to jam, disrupt, and potentially destroy satellites by both kinetic and non-kinetic means. So together, these trends really call into question the future U.S. ability to project power. And the question is, what do we do about it? In addition, those operational trends or operational capability shortfalls also have attendant strategic risks. One is crisis instability. Increasingly, adversaries may have an incentive to strike preemptively our forward bases, our forward deployed forces, and on-orbit satellites before they can be used against them. So in a crisis, we think about flowing forces into a couple of close-in theater air bases or land bases and ports. Rather than being stabilizing and a source of deterrence, they can actually be destabilizing and lead adversaries to preemptively attack. Second, trying to play a symmetric defense is very costly. And when you look at SM-3 interceptors or other missile interceptors, they're typically somewhere between 5-to-1 to 10-to-1 the cost of the incoming missiles. So that's just a very cost-imposing path to go down to try to actively defend against incoming missiles that are much less expensive than the interceptors you're shooting at them. And lastly, enemies increasingly perceive that they've increased the cost of U.S. intervention sufficiently high that we may not intervene, that we'll be self-deterred from intervening. That adversaries and prospective adversaries and other observers around the world may question the capability and willingness of the U.S. to follow through on its deterrent threats, thus undermining deterrence. At the same time, allies may begin to question the credibility of U.S. security commitments and either go on their own to develop their own security measures or to bandwagon against countries we wouldn't like to see them bandwagon with. So one option to restore U.S. power projection and sustain it over the long term, I argue, is leveraging key enduring sources of U.S. advantage. And they're listed here: unmanned operations, extended range air operations, low observable air operations, undersea warfare, then complex systems engineering and integration to bring it all together into a common network. What I'd like to stress here, though, is it's not just about technology. It's not just about gadgets. It's about a core competence in these areas, which means technology, to be sure, but also the industrial base, the training and recruitment of skilled personnel, and the hard-learned operational experience, in several cases over decades, that the U.S. military has in these areas. So taken together, the people part, the technology part, the industrial base part, and that operational experience makes it very hard for adversaries to counter or duplicate. And that's why I think these are enduring sources of advantage. So think about unmanned operations. The U.S. is a world leader in unmanned systems development, as well in operation, as well as supporting technologies like artificial intelligence and autonomy. And we've operated large numbers of UAVs, employed them in combat, trained operators, sustained these operations, planned these operations, and we've done it for decades. UAVs can provide responsive, persistent coverage and they can be especially useful for finding and attacking mobile or time-sensitive targets over wide geographic areas, which is something we're going to increasingly need to do in the future. Also, unmanned systems offer much lower life cycle costs relative to manned aircraft. There's fewer aircraft needed for training, and just when you add all the aircraft up to get the same operational effect, you can do it with much fewer aircraft on the unmanned side. The challenge, however, though, is the currently planned joint fleet, primarily of short to medium range aircraft, as you can kind of see up here, I think. I could have laser. So one of the things you'll hear across this presentation as a theme is balance. Right now, most of the fleet of unmanned systems is sort of in this medium range category, with a small slice for the Triton and Global Hawk. It's also almost entirely non-stealthy. The only thing that's sort of in the stealth category right now is potentially U-class down the road, which is still an issue of much debate, and the RQ-170. Every other UAV in the inventory is non-stealthy. Every UAV in the inventory currently now is not air refuelable. So in the future, it might make sense to shift towards increasingly longer range systems, more survivable stealthy platforms, and air refuelable platforms. And that's something I'll talk about more in a minute. Extended range air operations. No other country in the world can project air power over global distances like the United States and do it on a high tempo, sustained basis. We've been doing this for decades. And you see developing, building, and maintaining heavy bombers for these types of operations. Aerial refueling capability is a key enabler for these operations. I think it will have an even more profound effect on unmanned operations. And this is really an inheritance of the first offset strategy, the new look, and the development of Strategic Air Command and their development in the 50s and into the 60s of the global aerial refueling capability. One of the potential synergies going forward is the combination of aerial refueling and air refuelable UAVs. Because unlike manned aircraft, they don't get tired. Pilots, there's no pilot to get tired. So they potentially have very, very long mission endurances, potentially 20, 40, 60, 80 hours they could remain aloft. And that just opens the door to a range of new operational concepts about how you use air power. But again, there's a question of balance in the portfolio. So in terms of extended range, the vast majority of U.S. aircraft, if you look over sort of an average between 2014 and 2023, the vast majority is short range. Our air power is fundamentally TAC air, fighter aircraft. The small number of bombers, this little sliver of bombers. It's also almost entirely manned. So again, getting to the issue of balance in the future again, we might want to shift a little bit more towards longer range and increasingly unmanned capabilities in this area. And low observable air operations. We've been at this. This is actually a legacy of the second offset strategy. We have a qualitative lead in the design, manufacture, maintenance, and operation of low observable aircraft. You can see they've been used repeatedly over the last couple decades. They allow us to do high volume precision attacks in denied airspace. But the challenge again is when you look at the portfolio, an area that we really is a key enduring advantage for us, we're not really investing very heavily in this. In terms of non-stealthy aircraft, you can see the big, most of the inventory is in the non-stealthy category. Whether it's long range or short range, it's non-stealthy. So this is another area where we may want to adjust the balance in the portfolio. Undersea warfare. Submarines allow us to do anti-submarine warfare, anti-surface warfare, a great tool for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, both in peacetime and wartime. Soft support, and then, of course, no-notice precision land attack. We've used them extensively for decades, and I think it's arguably an area of enduring advantage for us that we could exploit more heavily. The problem, again, getting back to the balance issue, you look at the Navy, it's fundamentally a surface fleet. You can kind of see how that breaks out in terms of surface versus subsurface. So the question is, should that balance shift however much over the next several decades? But another disturbing trend is if you say, okay, I agree undersea warfare is an important area and that undersea payload is something we want more of. Well, the trend is actually in the opposite direction. By 2028, the amount of undersea capacity we have will drop by about 60%, when we really should probably be going in the other direction. So the question is, how do we stop that decline in undersea capacity in a cost-effective way? And then, of course, we need to bring it all together. Our industrial base, our military and defense industry have designed, built, and operated very complex weapon systems and architectures. It's part science and it's part art, and we've gotten very good at it. And this is an area that we should continue to exploit, to link together these heterogeneous, geographically distributed platforms into a sort of a coherent global surveillance strike network. Okay, so what I suggest is one concept for a new offset strategy would be to take those 5 areas of enduring advantage and link them together into a joint global surveillance strike network. The network would be balanced in that it would have tailored attributes for different roles and environments. This is sort of getting to the high-low mix. Not everything has to be high-end, but it would be a mix of legacy systems and new systems, of low systems and high systems to give us presence around the world. It would be resilient, and then it would be less dependent on close-in bases. It would have reduced sensitivity to air defenses around the world, and it would be more tolerant of disruptions to space-based capabilities. It would be responsive. Part of the idea would be to take available survivable forward presence and persistence, and then global responsiveness to be able to get there very quickly wherever we're needed around the world. And then lastly, it would be scalable. Getting back to the National Defense Panel and the need to be able to cover down on potentially multiple hotspots or crises around the world, this type of network could be scaled up or scaled down as conditions warranted around the world. So how might we do that given where we are? One, that's okay. How might we better exploit our advantages in unmanned operations? One, we could use long-endurance UAVs to hedge against the loss of space-based ISR, navigation, timing, and communications. I think we should definitely proceed with an automated aerial refueling capability, not only for unmanned systems, but for manned aircraft as well. Again, taking advantage of that potentially very long mission endurance that you could have with unmanned systems. And to rebalance the fleet, remember we talked about how the issue of balance and how the current fleet is very heavily towards manned aircraft. I would suggest investments in these 3 areas: a stealthy HALE, high altitude, long endurance ISR UAV, and then 2 companions, a stealthy refuelable land-based UCAS, unmanned combat air system, and a sea-based unmanned combat air system. In both cases, stealthy and air refuelable. And then also in the unmanned realm, investing more heavily in UUVs, unmanned undersea vehicles, to expand the footprint and capacity of our more limited attack submarine fleet. In terms of exploiting our advantages in long-range and low-observable air operations, kind of taking those together, I think we need to stay ahead in low-observable technology, which means harnessing, I think, the synergy between low passive radar cross-section reduction and advanced electronic attack, and focusing R&D on sort of the next, I think, big challenge, which is going to be infrared signature management. And then second, we need to increase the portion of the fleet that is long-range and survivable in medium to high threat environments. And as I mentioned earlier, the backbone of our future long-range, low-observable fleet would be stealthy HALE UAVs, the stealthy land and sea-based UCAS, and the long-range strike bomber, which is now currently under development, and the B-2 for as long as it's operational. And then the undersea, as mentioned, we already rely on SSNs and SSGNs for a wide range of missions. The question is, how do we expand the amount of capacity we have undersea, as well as the flexibility of that undersea capacity? So I suggest investments in the Virginia payload module, which to significantly increase at relatively low cost the payload of future attack submarines, a family of UUVs for littoral operations of a wide variety, potentially looking at towed or seabed payload modules, so putting payload on the sea floor or in towable modules that could be put into position by submarines as a way of offboarding that payload from the submarine. If it's going to be challenging to have a dramatically increased manned submarine fleet, maybe we can have additional payload forward by taking advantage of these types of payload modules. Then lastly, to develop a wider array of undersea weapons beyond Tomahawk. There's no reason why we shouldn't have a longer range anti-surface and anti-submarine weapon, surface-to-air or missile defense weapon, new ground attack options, electronic warfare and decoys. The ability of the attack submarine to get in under the adversary's anti-access area denial umbrella is very significant. And then the question is, what's the highest leverage payloads you could carry on the submarine to take advantage of that access in close? And I would argue that more land attack isn't necessarily the highest leverage option because we have other mechanisms of doing land attack from standoff range, either with bombers or with surface combatants. And then lastly, we need to link this all together, develop an advanced battle management system to fuse and correlate all this ISR data, and help us make smart decisions about how to allocate ISR and strike resources quickly and effectively. Easy to say, probably DARPA hard to do, but this is something that we really need to focus some attention on. So this is a little bit of an eye chart. An attempt to try to capture some of the major elements of what a joint global surveillance strike network might look like. And let me just try to decipher this chart a little bit for you. So up on top is sort of the medium to high threat environment, and on the bottom is the low to medium threat environment. So one observation is that all the systems that are up here can also be brought to bear down here, but the reverse is not true. These systems cannot be brought to bear against threats in the medium to high threat environment. A second observation is the vast majority of our defense investment portfolio, both in terms of current force structure and modernization, is either here in sort of the low to medium threat environment or in the regional capabilities. Where we really have a gap or an imbalance in the portfolio is in global reach capabilities that are effective in medium to high threat environments. So this is kind of the core of where I would suggest we should rebalance the portfolio, because these capabilities give you pan threat spectrum utility, whereas the other ones do not. But it doesn't mean we have to get rid of all these things. Again, it's a question of balance. What is the right balance in the portfolio to cover down on the full threat spectrum? And where do we need some additional resources to have that global responsiveness and the ability to project power regardless of the threat environment? And that's really up in here. Okay, so what should we be thinking about in addition to fleshing out the strategy and coming up with a family of operational concepts nested under that strategy? What are the types of things that we were going to need in terms of tools in the toolbox to make this a reality? Well, full speed ahead on long-range strike bomber, as I mentioned before, rebalancing the portfolio with some additional stealthy unmanned systems, either both a HAIL ISR UAV and then carrier and land-based UCAS, both for the manned fleet as well as for the unmanned fleet that can really exploit unmanned aerial refueling, or I should say automated aerial refueling for unmanned systems that allow them to really exploit that mission endurance that they offer. We got to look at hedges against degradation or loss of space. So looking at terrestrial alternatives, whether it's aerostats or UAVs or more advanced IMUs, miniaturized atomic clocks for the timing piece. There's a bunch of programs underway at DARPA, but the point is we still want to have GPS. We still want to use it in peacetime, but we just need to be prepared, have a plan B in the event that GPS is degraded or disrupted. Undersea, another big area that we need to exploit more effectively. I already mentioned multi-mission long-endurance UUVs, options for, again, increasing undersea payload capacity and flexibility. I won't read all the items there. Looking at more both active and passive undersea sensor networks. Getting back into the naval mine business. This is an area that we let atrophy over the last several decades, potentially a very cost-imposing option for our adversaries. looking at how to restore the cost exchange ratio on the defense side using electromagnetic railguns or directed energy weapons that offer much higher, much deeper magazines and much lower cost per shot, which would be a better way to try to deal with some of the threats to our forward-based assets and bases. New counter-sensor weapons, and then looking at how can we turn some of this A2AD threat against our adversaries by creating local A2AD networks on the territory of our allies and partners and friends around the world. Things like mobile air defense missiles, coastal defenses, mines, UUVs, to make them much less appetizing for an aggressor to try to attack. So, there's a long Christmas list, wish list of things that we need to be pursuing to rebalance the portfolio. How do we do it in a period of fiscal austerity? We can talk more about this, but one of them is to shed excess base infrastructure. DoD has been asking for the last several years for a new BRAC to shed some of that excess infrastructure. It's still a good idea. The DoD has also asked for this current budget, as well as the past several budgets, to take some steps to rein in personnel costs in terms of housing, medical care, and so on. Just small changes there reap tremendous benefits over time, just given the number of folks involved. We can pursue burden sharing with some of our allies. Several of our allies might be interested in pursuing some of these new technologies with us and integrating into this global surveillance strike network. We should take advantage of that option to the extent we can. There are some programs that just make sense to refocus or realign. So take, for example, U-class and the follow-on, envisioned follow-on to the F-18, the FA-XX, reshape those programs to make them more like what we're likely to need in the future, meaning a long-range, stealthy, survival, high-payload, unmanned air vehicle off the carrier deck. So it's not so much a new program as a slightly altered version of the current programs. And then lastly, we may need to restore balance by scaling back force structure and modernization in programs that are really optimized for power projection and permissive, meaning low to medium threat environments. And the question of how much of that we have to do is partially a function of what happens with sequestration and the Budget Control Act and what Congress authorizes or appropriates for the Department of Defense. So to conclude, our adversaries are developing their own ISR strike networks, which was basically the second offset strategy for us, with an emphasis on missile systems to challenge conventional U.S. power projection, to offset those investments in A2AD capabilities. DoD should leverage its core competencies in the areas I've discussed: unmanned systems, long-range and low-observable air operations, undersea warfare, and complex systems engineering, to develop a balanced global surveillance strike network, again with this high-low mix that offers the attributes you see there: balanced, resilient, globally responsive, and scalable. If deterrence fails, that network and those capabilities in that network could be brought to bear to deny an aggressor their war aims, inflict asymmetric punishment, taking a page out of the New Look, and then roll back, if necessary, his A2AD network and as part of a joint phased combined arms power projection campaign. But the idea would be that those forces are forward or could rapidly respond and hopefully be able to deny the aggressor their war aims in the first place. Then lastly, this type of network could be realized in the mid to late 2020s if R&D begins now and the government stays the course over the next several decades. Just like the New Look and just like the offset strategy in the 1970s, these things take time, and it would take decades of sort of commitment to sort of this general plan to go forward.